We'll just maybe wait. We'll wait a minute till 8 until we start.
Yes.
Get going. Everyone is getting notifications now.
Yeah.
See this? Ah, wonderful. Okay, I can see it on the other screen, so I can check for questions. Hi, everyone who's joining in. Welcome. We'll just wait a minute or two before we get started. We will start right on the hour. So thank you. Make yourselves comfortable. Grab a cup of tea or water or whatever it is that keeps you going for the hour. It's water for me.
Yeah.
Start it.
Some mango juice for me, though it's not natural. You don't get mangoes here, so.
Do what you can.
Yes.
Absolutely. We're just getting to the end of the mango season, so we are trying to buy as many as possible.
Yeah, it's almost over the mango season. It's like
very much.
Yeah.
But yes. All right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you are well, and thank you for joining us once again. And if you are joining us for the first time today, then thank you for coming to our event. This is Partition 73. Today we are on the fourth Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, fourth day. We are on the fourth day of a 16-day event. And as I mentioned yesterday, we are moving in, or yesterday we moved in, to looking at cultural components of Partition 73. So looking at the arts, and we started with the visual arts, and today we are moving into the musical arts, which we will get to in a second, and tomorrow looking at architecture, specifically in the city of Lahore. I'm very excited for today's talk, and I hope you guys are too. Give us a hi if you're here, drop us a little comment, let us know what you're excited about, let us know what you've enjoyed in the last few days. If there's anything that you're particularly curious about, please do. Just a reminder to everyone who was watching yesterday, Manisha Baswani, who was with us, very, very kindly offered to share her project Postcards from Home with anyone who is interested by dropping her a quick email. You can just email her at manishabaswani@gmail.com, and she's offered to share that with anyone who is interested. So please do get in touch with her. As we saw in the slide, it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful project. So very, very kind of her to share that. And we touched yesterday on, culture being the only channel that is really open to us, while political channels are largely closed, geographical channels are largely closed. It is really the cultural channel that we need to exercise the most between the two countries, because not only is that what's open to us, but it's also a very old and defined South Asian identity. And we saw yesterday in the visual arts, and we will see today also in the musical arts, that the geographical split, as with nature, in culture is also somewhat perhaps unnatural. And perhaps you think it's not, but we'll hear more on that today. So, the idea of does music have a citizenship? Or is music regional? Music doesn't have a passport, so does it have such a clear identity? Is music purely a religious vessel? Is that what it is? What is the role of music in bringing us together, and what did this partition mean for musicians and their identity? And did the identity of their music suddenly become separate to their identity of self, where maybe in the past they were actually one identity? So without further ado, let's get started.
सुबह जैसे आँख खोली थे हमने सोचा कि चलो चाय वाय का बंदोबस्त करते हैं, देखते जैसे आँख खोली इधर भी मुर्दा और मक्खियां ऐसी उनके ऊपर कि जैसे कि लेयर ऑफ मक्खियां नहीं होती, जब तक असी जिंदा तुसी भी जिंदा हो, असी मर गए तो फिर उसी जिम्मेवारी।
Hello, 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 hello. I gave a little bit of an introduction before the credits today, but as you may have gathered, today we are here to talk about partition and music. We are going to be looking specifically at Punjab and the musicians and music of Punjab. For those of you who saw on Instagram, I put a little nugget on there today that hopefully brought you to this talk to find out more. But someone far more knowledgeable than me, fortunately, is going to be speaking with us today. And so with absolute great pleasure, I would love to introduce to all of you Dr. Radha Khurana Kapuria, who is joining us from Manchester today. Radha and I actually have known one another. We lived in the UK at the same time, and I've been following her work through Facebook for many years. And I was so excited to have an opportunity to actually engage with her about it and talk to her about it, and also bring it to everybody who's watching today, because it just is so fascinating, as we'll all find out together. Radha is currently the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow on the project Subverting Borders, Musicians, Nationalism and Memory in Punjab, 1947 to 1991. Her research interests are South Asian social, cultural, and gender history. And after today's talk, if you are interested, you are more than welcome to do a quick Google and read some of the fascinating articles that she has authored. So without further ado, Radha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ragini. It's a pleasure to be here. And your work is so interesting on food. And I love that today we're continuing the themes that you've begun speaking about, which is to see culture as this channel of, communication between India and Pakistan, and India and Bangladesh, and generally across the subcontinent, despite political borders. And I'm going to begin before I, start share screen, which has some of the slides that I want to share with all of you today. I want to begin with a story about a bridge in 19th century Punjab. And some of you may know about this. Some of you may not have heard about it. This is a bridge which is located near the Wagah border, between India and Pakistan. And it's today in India, so it's close to Amritsar. And it's called the Bridge of the Courtesan because in the early 19th century, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he was deeply in love with this courtesan called Bibi Mora, because she danced like a Moor or a peacock. And he used to come from Lahore, which is where his court was, and he would come to Amritsar, obviously, to go to the Golden Temple and pay his respects. But there are stories which tell us that often before going to the Golden Temple, he would stop near this, near where the current border is. And that's where Bibi Mora would come and perform for him at the Baradari. There was a little sort of architectural sarai or a resting house, traveler's house, and she would perform for him. One day when she was coming, her silver sandal slipped and fell into the canal, which was taking water to the Shalimar Gardens in Lahore. So she was very upset, and she said, I'm never going to perform for you again unless you build me a bridge. So of course, Maharaja Ranjit Singh obliged and built this bridge for her, which is called Pul Mora or Pul Kanjri or Tawaif Pul. It's called by all these names. Oh. And he went on to marry this woman despite sort of stiff orthodox opposition. But this story is just to tell you about the history of music in pre-partition, sort of even pre-British Punjab, and how musicians and dancers and courtesans were very powerful at this time during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's reign. And they enjoyed very handsome like handsome salaries and jagirs. So the courtesans were a very well-off class. And Bibi Mora was a very learned woman. And on this Pulmora site today, there is not just a mosque, because she was Muslim. There's also a temple. There's also a gurdwara, and of course, there's like it was a resting place for travelers. So with that story, I just want us to keep that in mind as we think about post 47. So this would have been 1810s, 1800s, so early part of the 19th century. My current research is looking at what 47 meant for the musicians of Punjab. And my PhD research had looked at, as the story would have given you an idea, my PhD work looked at pre-47 Punjab. So as Ragini said, is there a sense of citizenship which is different from musicians as opposed to the rest of us, perhaps? Is there something about music which connects and bonds? And I ask this question very seriously because musicians are often seen as the one community and which really, bond. Music is something which is so in the moment, and there's so much shared heritage around music that you're connected in a way that you cannot be otherwise. But what did musicians think of the partitions? How did they survive it? How did they resist it? Were there any who participated in this idea? So there's a lot of questions to be explored. And I'll begin with this long quote, which is to talk about why is it important to look at this history. And there is a historian called Gyan Pandey who's come up with this idea of the unarchived history. And he says when you archive, so when we write history, we're looking at sources in the archives. But he says, how do you archive? What enters the archive? So archiving is accompanied with the process of unarchiving, and many aspects of social cultural life are seen as inconsequential, not important, and therefore unhistorical. So he says the archive as a site of remembering is also at the same time a project of forgetting. And I think musicians and dancers is very clearly that section which is forgotten, that section of society. And that's what motivates me to do this research.
That's so true. I think part of what we're doing in these 16 days, getting people to tell their stories is exactly that. It's these stories that don't make it to the history books.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to just play a short snippet of this song from the 1950 movie Madari.
कल जड़े संलखपति अज पल्ले कोई नहीं थेला कल जड़े संलखपति अज पल्ले कोई नहीं थेला विच किताबां लिखिया दुनिया चार दिना दा मेला विच किताबां लिखिया दुनिया चार दिना दा मेला मैं कोई झूठ बोलिया मैं कोई कुफर बोलिया बस फिर जफियां पालो आजादी दे गुन गालो.
So the translation of the words are up on the screen. And those of you who could understand it would have seen the humor in this song. It's talking about the irony of partition and this sort of sense of dispossession, which so many people experienced, saying those who were millionaires yesterday don't have a penny today. And, and then he says, it's done in a very sort of folk Punjabi tune. And it says, it ends with, okay, so let's just embrace each other and sing the praises of freedom. It's very sarcastic because freedom doesn't seem to bring anything great for most people, given partition. But why I chose this song is because the music for it was given by Ustad Allah Rakha, who is the famous tabla exponent, the father of Ustad Zakir Hussain. And as we know, he was from the sort of Dogri speaking area of Jammu, but he popularized the Punjab Gharana of tabla but he gave music for so many of these Punjabi films. And the very survival of the soundtrack of Madari is a story which talks about how borders are irrelevant when it comes to preserving culture. So the man who is responsible for finding this soundtrack again is Firdaus Ali, who was a Kashmiri scholar who lived in Britain. And that's a photo of him taken in the house of Ustad Allah Rakha's daughter in London. So behind him is a photo of Ustad Allah Rakha and his wife. And so the only, apparently there was, the Bombay Film Archives, there was a fire and it perished, the copy of the film. So there was no way you could recover it. They tried, Ustad Allah Rakha tried to ask people in Punjab, in Pakistan as well, because the film was popular in Pakistan too, if there were any copies of this film, and they couldn't find anything. I think this was sometime in the 90s. But Firdaus Ali then found a copy in Southall in London, and that's how we today could listen to that song.
Wow.
So this is an interesting, yeah, and he was also Kashmiri, which is, of course, as we know, it's the region that suffered the most and the longest because of partition, right? Yeah. So, and yet this sort of kind of, this moral kind of custodianship and responsibility to preserve these songs. And of course, he found it in London, and then his daughter, Allah Rakha's daughter in London, sent it back to him in Bombay. So it actually took this very circuitous route across, halfway across the world. Yeah, so that's a map of Punjab. The one on the left with the doabs in pink is of colonial Punjab, so undivided Punjab. In fact, all of these are undivided Punjab, except for the one on the bottom right corner, which shows you the current day boundaries. And the bits in orange are the Punjab of Ranjit Singh, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, so his sort of Sikh empire. Okay. I'm not trying to romanticize or say that, any kind of empire is problematic, but there was a certain cosmopolitanism to his politics, which seems to be, was in a sense, it was lost after that. So which is why perhaps we look to his time with this kind of rose tinted glasses.
Can you say maybe just another sentence about that for those who might not know?
Yes, I mean, so Maharaja Ranjit Singh was the last indigenous ruler of Punjab before British, well, not the last fully sovereign, because after he died in 1839, there was 10 years during which scores of his sons and grandsons came to power, but there was so much sort of internal politics and politics with the sort of British rivals that it was a very tenuous hold. So the kind of control he had and the power he had was never seen again. And 10 years later, Punjab was annexed by Henry Lawrence and the East India Company. So in that sense, and also he had, like, his prime ministers were Muslim. Of course, it was the first Sikh empire, but it was very consciously also cosmopolitan, which is not to say that it was easy, because he'd faced, opposition throughout his career. Mm-hmm. But it was a very interesting time in the history of Punjab. And I'm sure you'll hear more about it from Professor Nadra Khan, who will talk about architecture at his court. So this image is very interesting. It's advertisements for harmonium dealers. The one on the left is from 1913 in Lahore, the Tribune. It's something I found in the archives. So Sadhu Singh, harmonium manufacturer and watch merchant in Suha Bazaar in Lahore. And then almost 100 years later, I found this really nice kind of, nice as in very, like, peeling paint image of a harmonium dealer in Indian Punjab, which is where I started doing my research at the Har Vallabh festival in Jalandhar. So I think it just shows you how, the archive and the field are so connected. I think I mentioned these questions. I won't go through them again, but how did this experience of trauma impact the lives and the career trajectories of musicians? And more importantly, or as importantly, was there an active participation in new identities as Indian or Pakistani? And if that was so, how did this narrative of nostalgia for pre-partition times complicate this citizenship, this idea of being Indian or Pakistani? This is a reference to some of the books which people have written on what partition has meant. So this is something people can read. The book on the left is Boundaries of Belonging. It looks at how citizenship changed. Ideas of citizenship were so closely tied to partition because independence came with partition. And Uditi Sen's book looks at the Bengal border. So I just like invoking this literature because looking at musicians through a citizenship lens. Now this is a very interesting newspaper report of Janmashtami being celebrated. So Janmashtami is the celebration of Sri Krishna's birthday, so a very important Hindu festival. And as we can see, this is textual evidence in the written record of this festival being celebrated in 1950s in Pakistan, right? So 3 years after partition, you still have these festivals being celebrated in what we would otherwise, especially in India, what we would imagine to be a very rigid, theocratic Islamic state. But as we can see, there were these forms of multiculturalism which persisted for a long enough time. And you see a man in the foreground who's holding a sitar. So just to see how classical music was connected to these religious festivals as well, in a way that we don't today see as much. We wouldn't imagine a sitar performance on Janmashtami, for example. This is something that was probably very common in pre-47 Punjab, right?
And was it this sort of coming together of religion and culture would be the reason why it would be celebrated, or tradition, or why in 1915 Lahore is this happening, or is it tradition?
So as we know, colonial Lahore was a very important city for people of all religions, but also for the Hindus. And there was a very strong Hindu middle class. Right. So there, I think it's referring back to that tradition. But if we see the report, if you see the text on the right-hand side bottom, it says there were stage performances of a troupe of artists from Amritsar as well. Mm-hmm. So there was also this cross-border kind of exchange of musicians and performers after partition. And so if this is the example of the celebration of a Hindu festival, equally in interviews I did, I found that people in Jalandhar remember how Ustad Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's father and uncle, who were originally from Jalandhar and had gone to Pakistan after partition, they came around the same time in post 47. They came for an urs in the Sufi shrine in Jalandhar at the Imam Nasr Sufi shrine. So, and all Jalandhar residents gathered to hear them,
right,
because it was such a big moment, sort of welcoming the sons of the soil back for this great performance. Again, similarly, as was with the case in this gathering, there's Hindus and Muslims attending this musical performance. Mm-hmm. And even at the Urs in Jalandhar, you had Sikhs and Hindus in Jalandhar attended. So in a sense, music becomes this occasion where people will participate, even in, religious festivals, which you may not participate in the religion aspect of it, but the music will attract people.
Right.
I want to quickly move on to the example of Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, who many of you in the audience will know as one of the greatest vocalists of Hindustani music. He represented the Patiala Gharana, but he was hailed from the city of Kasur in Punjab near Lahore. And he was also, so he was trained in the Kasur Gharana as well. So, and the two Gharanas were connected. So he was the Kasur Patiala Gharana. And he's very interesting because he was a citizen of Pakistan for 10 years, from 47 to 57. Mm-hmm. For obvious reasons, you find your home, whichever side of the border you find your home and you will go there. And so he moved because he was living pre-47 in India, and then he moved to Lahore, lived in Pakistan for 10 years, had a falling out with the director of Radio Pakistan because there was an attempt to sort of cleanse the music of very Hindu reference in post 47 Pakistan. And this has been documented by filmmakers like Yusuf Saeed and many people who've written about this. But Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan felt that this was tampering with tradition, what's coming down, oral history and knowledge being disseminated through the generations. So he objected to this. And then Morarji Desai, who went on to be Prime Minister of India and who was Chief Minister of Bombay, he loved music and he kind of extended this invitation through Nehru. He convinced Nehru to ensure that Ghulam Ali is granted Indian citizenship. And so in 57, Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan moved to India and then resided in Bombay. And he died in 68 in Hyderabad, the Indian state of Hyderabad. And so you can see he was for almost an exact period of time, he was a Pakistani citizen and again for 10, 11 years, an Indian citizen.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating.
And, he's supposed to have famously said that if in every home one child was taught Hindustani music, this country would never have been partitioned.
I've read this. And I think it's his focus on the persistence of art, the persistence that art requires, and the knowledge that art requires, is something that that really comes through. And I see you have a couple of clips here, but I might just interject with a quick question of: is Hindustani music is that when people are learning classical music in Pakistan today, has it taken on new nomenclature or does it remain as was?
So I think I can answer that. I mean, I don't have very in-depth knowledge about exactly what's happening in Pakistan, but I don't think it has changed radically to that kind of degree. I think that period when there was this aggressive attempt to, remove references to Hindu gods, for example, it was very much during that time. And today, I think there is a greater openness and recognition of, there isn't this sense of rigidity anymore. But the rags are the same and there's so much commonality. The compositions, the bandishes are the same. And, the gharanas are split between India and Pakistan. So there isn't much of any substantive difference.
Right.
If you the musicians who are interviewed today who talk about that time, they also talk about it like, that's really funny, or it's almost like, how can you do this? So I think the bulk of audiences and musicians in Pakistan are no longer, they don't have this sense of that stuff should be changed. Because this is like the classical tradition. Knowledge in this is what helps sing all kinds of things. So there is a respect for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me just play this quick clip. It's in Rag Gujri Todi, and those of you who've seen the Hindi film Dilli 6, which has this song has been remastered by A.R. Rahman, but let's look at the original, which is very nice in itself. And you'll see him do very intricate tans and very in the sort of tappa tradition of Punjab, which sounds like, it's like lightning. So that was one of his hallmarks. So this is a Thumri, and he's saying Bhor bhai tori baat takat piya, that all night, it's morning now, I've been waiting Tumhari raat tak rahe, I've been waiting for your arrival. And it's a complaint. It's sung in the woman's voice, in the sense that, you know, the woman is complaining that where have you been all night? And the next stanza goes on to say that you were at my Sotan's house and all of this. So, you know, where have you been? So it's a typical song of longing and complaint, which is very common. And, you know, this kind of complaint would often be also directed at Krishna, who was all, as we know, is famous for, you know, playing with the milkmaids and not being faithful. Um, I want to talk about a musician from Punjab who wasn't as well known as Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, and in fact is actually, we would have not known, many of us would have not known about him unless this 1947 Partition archive, which is led by Gunita Bhalla, and her sort of people who did interviews as part of this archive, met this gentleman called Vilayat Khan. And his is a different kind of story because his home is in Ludhiana, which is in Indian Punjab. And he was also forced, like Bade Ghulam Ali Khan was not forced. It was his home which was in Pakistan. So he migrated to be home. This man had to leave home because, as we know, many people were forced to leave their homes during partition. So many Muslims did not opt for Pakistan either. So he went to Sargodha in Pakistani Punjab, which is incidentally where my Nani's family is from. But yeah, sorry. So that's photos from the website of the interviews conducted with him in 2008. And he he also stayed for 10 years in Pakistan, but because he was away from home, he was not happy. And he said, for the 10 years I was there, I was doing odd jobs. My singing left me. So he was more in the folk tradition and he stopped singing. And then after 10 years, he decided, I've had enough. I want to try and go back home. Right. And he collected loads of money. And it was a very arduous journey he made on foot to come back to Ludhiana, and selling his mother's jewelry, for example, and doing all kinds of things. And he said that, you know, once he arrived in India, into his home village, his music came back to him. So this is, yeah. So this is another kind of story of a musician affected by partition. And for Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, it is a move away from the homeland. You know, he's left home behind and he's come to India for a sort of professional recognition. But for this man, it's coming back home and sort of leaving this sort of forced migration behind. If you have any questions, this would be a good time to pause, because then I'll talk about some other issues next.
There's one question I think we can take up. Tanya Joshi is asking, and I think this is pertaining perhaps to the nomenclature and the knowledge question around it, you know, using the same language, I think. And she asks, can we say the same about Indian classical dance as well, and the passing on of that knowledge?
I really am so sorry. I do not know enough about Indian dance. So I don't want to say something and then I don't want to mislead anybody. But the good thing is that we have stories which people like Yusuf Saeed, who's made this film called Khayal Darpan, you know, in the movie he made on classical music and dance in Pakistan. He made this film now some 16 years ago, and it's available to view. And in that, he interviewed dancers in Pakistan as well. So Shima Kirmani. And what's interesting when you look at these dancers is you find this history of people from India going to Pakistan and setting up schools as well. So there was a period when you had teachers going from various parts of India. And so then there are these dancers who continue this tradition in Pakistan as well. There's also the dancer Indu Mitha, who taught Bharatnatyam, and she's retired now, but her students still dance. So there are these very interesting people who kind of learned and who continued teaching students in Pakistan, and I'm sure there are more. Right. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to talk about custodianship. So we looked at citizenship, which is how do you belong to a nation, but there's also this sense of custodianship, like Firdaus Ali protecting this recording and saving it, for future generations. And this one scholar who looks at literature and post-colonial literature in India, he says that custodianship is a responsibility for the other. So the other meaning the community which you don't come from, or the community with that is seen as your rival in society, or which is seen as your enemy.
Right.
But how do you have a responsibility for the other through acts of cultural and historical inheritance? And very importantly, he says it's not manipulation or control of the past for establishing authority in the present. So it's not manipulating this past for your own political gains or for your own purposes, but it's animated by a sense of gratitude for the past generations. And he very nicely says to transmit something, to future generations without seizing or taking control of it, this might be the task of custodianship. And this is important because without custodianship, without these patrons and custodians of music, you cannot have this cross-border exchange, right? So this sense of, if I'm a Hindu, I have a responsibility to ensure that these musical forms, which are the naats and the marsiyas, which were very Islamic, they need to also be preserved, right? And vice versa, which is what some of the people learning Bharatnatyam in Pakistan would be doing. So that's the kind of sense.
And I suppose Ustad Bari Ghulam Ali Khan's reason for leaving that argument with Radio Pakistan is in some way a testament to this, that we cannot change what is in order to be something that is not.
Yeah, and exactly. So, and this sense of custodianship is very visible in architecture. For example, now we've had Kartarpur Sahib open last year, the corridor for, Nanak's resting place. And the Muslim followers of Nanak in Pakistan ensured that his shrine never died, right? So the grave was always a living grave. And similarly in Ludhiana, in Indian Punjab, despite so many mosques being demolished and razed to the ground, there are some Sikh elders who've ensured that this mosque will stand tall, despite there being no Muslims in the village, as an act of, preserving the memory of the past, of this sort of shared sense of a culture. You also find it in books. So this is a book which was published in Pakistan, the blue cover. It says Geeta Di Gunj. It looks at Punjabi film songs in Pakistan from 1947 to 2006. And then the Patiala University in India, published a Gurmukhi version of this. So that's also in publication. So this is how and here's another great example of this custodian, Ashwini Kumar, who was the man who modernized the Harvallabh Music Festival in Jalandhar. And he was a great fan of Roshnara Begum, who was one of the most important vocalists, female vocalists of 20th century India and Pakistan. So her husband moved to Pakistan, so she followed him. And Ashwini Kumar tried really hard to convince Roshnara Begum to come and sing at Jalandhar, but she would refuse because she was a recluse. Finally, he got through to her because her husband was also a police official like Ashwini Kumar in the sort of colonial police constabulary, and they were friends. So through her husband, he managed to convince her, and he because he was a high-ranking policeman, this was in the 60s, he managed to smuggle her across the border without a proper visa. So there's this kind of, going rogue story. Yeah. So that's the kind of
importance, the importance of her art and her skill to the community, to go to that length. That's a real testament to that.
And he would claim that, audiences in Bombay, where she was from, they kept pining for her, but she only came to Jalandhar and sang, which I think may be a bit of a stretch, because I do think she came to Bombay as well, but maybe he didn't know about it. But he said she had the audience spellbound and they were all quiet because of her singing. This is the movie I keep referring to, Khayal Darpan, and that's Yusuf, who's made the film. He's a filmmaker from Delhi who went to Pakistan in 2000 and early 2000s, and it's a must watch, this film. It's like an ode to Lahore, an ode to the music of Pakistan. And one of the people who figures in the film is Raza Kazim, who's a 90-year-old lawyer, polyglot. He knows something about everything, and he's also a music lover and music instrument creator. And he's the grandfather of the two men who form Noori, the Pakistani band Noori. Wow. Yes, there's loads of songs on Coke Studio. But Raza Kazim invented the Sagar Veena, and his daughter plays on this very elaborate instrument, which is available. You can view it on YouTube. It's in the song Par Channa. So the Noori's mother is the one who's playing this. So I had an opportunity to meet him. I had an opportunity to go to Lahore for 6 days last year. So I had a very quick meeting with him. And for reasons of time, I'm not going to play the clip of the interview which he did, but it's a really exciting, because he went from Aligarh and he was one of the elite. So he went in an aeroplane to Pakistan. But the things he carried were all his musical records. So what he carried from home to Pakistan were these bulky RPM gramophone records, because those were the most precious, those and his books.
Wow.
So I think I'll soon be wrapping this up. We'll move to Noor Jahan and quickly wrap this up. I mean, based on what I've seen of these musicians, and keep in mind, this is new research. I haven't really done a lot yet. This is the beginning of my research. What I have found is that there are two kinds of nostalgia. There's a double nostalgia, sorry. There's a nostalgia for the feudal past, which musicians will always remember with a lot of respect, because the courts, the rulers, the princes are the ones who have traditionally, ensured music has thrived. So I talked about Ranjit Singh in the beginning.
Yeah.
And he had employed so many musicians and dancers. So there's a nostalgia for the feudal past, which Regula Qureshi, who's a very famous musicologist, has talked about in connection with Begum Akhtar. And for the musicians of Punjab, there's a nostalgia for Punjabiyat, for this undivided Punjab and the shared space. So it's a double nostalgia in that sense. And there's this wonderful musician who's no longer living, but his sons are in Lailpur in Faisalabad in Pakistan today. And he, in an interview in '96, told a researcher that, before partition, our father used to bring fruit packed in neat boxes, grapes, citrus, lychees, top quality fruit. And we were so rich that we used to play hockey with fruit, right? So this is the sense of abundance.
Right.
And I think as a food connoisseur, you would appreciate this anecdote about food, isn't it? Noor Jahan was the Lata Mangeshkar of Pakistan, right? And she was one of these most famous Punjabi female popular singers.
Yeah.
And she was a disciple of Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, who we recently saw. And she was so popular that even as late as 1956, which is almost 10 years since partition, like Morarji Desai and people in Bombay were trying to sell the Filmfare Awards by saying Noor Jahan will be coming and singing, Yeah. So Noor Jahan, still favorite of millions, is coming over from Pakistan. But I don't believe she actually came in 56, because there were no newspaper reports to the same.
Yeah.
So it was used as a way to attract audiences.
Yeah.
Yeah. She came in the 80s finally.
Okay.
And she did an interview with Dilip Kumar, who was her co-star from the 40s. So they were in a film together in 1947, ironically.
Wow.
And some of the older members in the audience would remember this song, Tum Bhi Bhula Do from Jugnu. So I'll quickly play it and then wrap up. Oops. So there's this sense that, you have to forget also, I mean, to continue living your new lives in these newly divided nations. I think this song is very apt. It's taken from a film in 47, made in pre-partition India. And it's talking about let's forget the bygone eras. And this was interesting because they recalled this in an interview, which is up on YouTube, a Doordarshan interview where Dilip Kumar was the host and he spoke to her about her career. And he asked her about partition and she said, the translation is up on English on the screen, but she said in Urdu, कि कैसा नफसा नफसी का आलम था, अपने बसे हुए घर को छोड़ के तो कोई छोड़ के जाना नहीं चाहता, मेरे मियाँ गए तो मैं भी चली गई. So she was living in Bombay because the film industry was based there. And so she followed her husband. And of course, that's a very easy, I think, given how rich and productive her career was in Pakistan. Sometimes musicians like to also cultivate this idea of nostalgia, but she was from Lahore, so it was also going back home for her. So it's not just this. Sometimes in an interview like this, there can be a formal celebration of, we didn't want to go, I didn't want to go, my husband left. So maybe there is some truth to that, but there is also truth to the fact that new borders means new markets for musicians as well, right? Yet she always maintained that my voice is the property of the public here as well as there. Meri आवाज आवाम की अमानत है, यहाँ भी वहाँ भी. So she really valued her audience in India. But nostalgic love can also only survive in a long distance relationship. So there's a sense that the borders continue to also, give fillip to this idea of nostalgia. And we can't forget that though often there are photos of these two being friends, Lata and Noor Jahan, they were also rivals, right? And they both sang songs for the wars in 65 and 71. Noor Jahan sang for the Pakistani soldiers. Lata sang, as we know, Hai Mere Watan Ke Logo. Though I think that was sung for the Chinese 62 war, but it was used also in the wars with Pakistan. So there is a very interesting dynamic there as well. So in short, it's not as straightforward. No, even though we would like to believe it is, but as researchers, we have to keep in mind that there's other things at play as well. I'll forward this. I won't go into this anecdote, but if there's Q&A, I can come back to it later. And I think we'll stop there with that image from Satish Gujral, which is really interesting, I think. So thank you, Ragini. I think I've been speaking nonstop. Should let you get in a few words.
Absolutely transfixed by your knowledge and your presentation and the clips that you've played. This has been wonderful. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and take any that we might have from folks as well. Folks, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the comments, and we will try and ask as many as possible. So you spoke about, the dual nostalgia. You spoke about the sort of settling dust of musicians, if you will, moving here, 10 years later, moving there, 10 years later, moving here. And you also talked about the fact that the feudal system was now no longer. It was broken over a few years. So can you speak a little bit to the changing patronage of Punjabi music after partition? Who were the audiences? I mean, Noor Jahan, Dilip Kumar, obviously this is now coming into Bollywood, but of the gharanas, of the traditional constructs, who was now listening to that?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So I think in both cases, in both India and Pakistan, the biggest patron was the state in terms of, and the radio. So these would be the biggest employers of musicians. And, in India, you have various, gradations of, you can be a grade 4, grade 2, grade 1 artist with the AIR. So there was a similar system in Pakistan. And this was a carryover from radio in the colonial time, which came in the mid-30s. So about a decade before partition. But it was still very new during British times. So at that time, with the princely states being still very important, those were the biggest centers. And therefore the gharanas are also almost all gharanas, not all, but most gharanas are connected to princely states. So Patiala is with the Patiala princely state, right? And therefore, I think the biggest change was that now you had the middle classes and the state, and you had like music clubs, which had also again started appearing in 20s and 30s, but they actually became the only avenue by the 60s, because it took about 10 years for the princely states to completely lose their power. And I think by the 60s and 70s, this was fairly complete.
Very interesting. We have lots of comments coming in saying how wonderful your presentation has been and how nostalgic folks are feeling and how much they've learned. So just to communicate that to you as well. And one other question, in some of your work, you've mentioned that the partition of Punjabi music was a long time coming. It was a long partition. And again, you have sort of touched on various elements of this through the presentation today, but can you maybe talk a little bit about how this began and evolved, and did it challenge an existing notion of Punjabi in Punjabi music?
Yes. So I think when I say it was a long time coming, it refers to the fact that there was this sort of soft communalization of music happening in the colonial period, like with much else, right?
Right.
So in the sense, what happens with 47 is the final sort of death blow, the death knell, but of things that had already, the processes had begun by the beginning of the 20th century. So late, or maybe the late 1890s, 1900s. One of the biggest reformers of Indian music was Pandit Paluskar, who was from Maharashtra, Pandit Vishnu Digambar Paluskar. And who did a lot to modernize and democratize Indian classical music. But at the same time, he also Hinduized it. And he sort of painted the Muslims as not as representative or as deserving of this tradition, which was very frankly, very unfair and not correct, because it's the musicians who have kept this sort of knowledge thriving have been for so many centuries, have been Muslim. And, so there's this, there was a sense of, so he started doing this. And in fact, his first success with setting up a music school was in Lahore. So, he was from West India, but he traveled all the way to Punjab, found success there because, you had the Arya Samaj and these Hindu reform organizations. So there was a ready ground for Paluskar's message to be received as well. So after success in Lahore, he then went back to Mumbai and Bombay at that time, and set up his Gandhar Mahavidyalaya. So, and his impact on the Harvallabh Music Festival and on other sort of musical activity in Punjab is very clearly available for us to see. So, so in a sense, it was a long time in the making, this divide.
Thank you. We have a question asking, can you interpret the painting on the screen for us, please?
Oh, how nice. Well, I've been trying to locate the title of this painting. So if anyone in the audience knows, please, and where it is housed, I need to find the original. I found this off the internet, and I find it very interesting. I think based on how I can interpret it, it's actually inverting the person who's listening is a woman. And usually in South Asian music, it's very gendered. It's the man who is listening and watching a woman perform. But this is actually the opposite. So there's this woman sitting with the rose in her hand and enjoying the tabla performance. And of two figures, so they could perhaps be brothers to signify India and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And around them is this sort of the flames of the violence of partition, right? So they're surrounded by this sort of turmoil and violence, and yet somehow they are united in music. Even the way they're sitting seems like there's a sense that they look like twins, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's interesting because also women were very powerful. So in sort of pre-colonial Punjab, pre-British Punjab, women performers were very powerful as a class. Okay. So it's also interesting to see that. I don't know if Gujral did all this consciously. Right. He was also from Punjab.
Yeah.
And an amazing painter. But I think it's really interesting. Since we're looking at this painting, I want to show this anecdote of Rag Deepak. Often people invoke Rag Deepak as, especially musicians will say that it was the fires of 1947 were like Rag Deepak. It was the impact of Rag Deepak. And, you know, as we know, Rag Deepak is a rag which is seen to have the power to create fire. There's this famous story at Akbar's court of Tansen singing Rag Deepak, and things went on fire, and his daughter had to come and sing Rag Malhar or one of the monsoon ragas to calm this fire down. But apparently Ustad Bundu Khan, whose image I have there, he was a musician from Old Delhi, very great, one of the greatest sarangi players. And at a Baitak in early 1947, he insisted on playing Rag Deepak. And his cousin Ustad Chand Khan, he said, please don't do this, you know, don't sing, don't play Rag Deepak. And later that year, when there was such riots and violence, Chand Khan said to his cousin, कि मैंने कहा था ना कि ये मनहूस राग नहीं बजाना है. So, you know, I had told you, hadn't I, not to play this sinister rag. I mean, it's a beautiful anecdote of a very difficult and painful time. Yeah. And Ustad Bundu Khan eventually had to follow his family to Karachi and Lahore. Okay. But his heart always remained in Old Delhi.
Old Delhi. Lovely.
But Ustad Chand Khan represented the Delhi Gharana, and in fact, he was the guru, Ustad of Iqbal Bano, who we know very famously as, who sung all the Faiz Ahmed Faiz ghazals. And Iqbal Bano was from Rohtak, and she grew up in Delhi. And she went to Pakistan in 1952, so some 5 years after. And that's because she was married to a family in Multan. Okay. So these connections of teachers being, you know, across the borders. Yeah.
We have another question that asks, any comment on Punjabi folk music of that time, folk artists, Jagga Jat, Dulha Bhatti, Heer Rancha, Soni Maiwal, Mirza Saiba, Shashi Bannu, Bulle Shah, so on and so forth?
Well, my focus in my research is very consciously on the classical musicians, mainly because folk music is seen as representative of Punjab, and it's something which is the first thing that comes to mind. And for that reason, it has been looked at. Except, I mean, the examples they've mentioned were very popular, and there were gramophone records which were cut with some of these themes.
Right.
So yes, folk music is very rich for Punjab as well, and you have loads of musicians who became popular because of technology and because of the gramophone industry at this in 30s and that time. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative, incredibly interesting, and I think the music speaks to everybody. And I think many folks have, heard this music, whether consciously or just in and around their surroundings. It's somehow familiar to most of us, and so I think it speaks to all of us when we learn more about it. So I have one final question asking, is there two, actually, maybe you can take them a little bit fast. One is asking, where is the Deepak Raga anecdote from?
Yes.
And then the other is there any information available on the musicians from the Bengal side?
Right. So the Rag Deepak anecdote was told to me by Ayub Aulia, who is the son-in-law of Ustad Allah Rakha, and he lives in London. He's also written a book called Sangeetkar in Urdu, which is where this anecdote also figures.
Mm-hmm.
And as to the musicians of Bengal, there are people who work on the bowls and the tradition there,
Right.
but I am yet to see a book or something which is like an in-depth kind of work on the music, but I'm sure there is. I mean, Bengal and Bengalis have been way ahead of so many of the literary tradition there is so strong that there would definitely be books in Bengali, in Bangla for sure, about this common musical links.
And I think, my understanding, the border, the official border on the Bengal side is more permeable when it comes to the sharing of arts and culture. There are still sort of several events that celebrate across the border. So I think that it is a different story in Bengal.
Yes, and it's a very different story also because post 71, Bangladesh is formed on a sense of linguistic identity. Absolutely. Which is why they embrace Tagore as the national poet, and so Robindra Sangeet is very popular in Bangladesh as well.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's these very strong connections.
Yeah, wonderful. With that, I think we'll close for this evening. But once again, thank you so much. All of the comments are a testament to just how interesting this session has been. And thank you everybody for joining us. Just to remind you, the film that Radha mentioned is Khayal Darpan by Yusuf Saeed, and that has been recommended to us as a must watch. So I think one takeaway for all of us from this wonderful session is to go away and watch that film. And that alongside obviously the many other nuggets of information that we've been gifted today by Radha. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Ragini. I can share the link to the film as well. I think you can watch it online on some documentary hub. Yeah. And the anecdote about the kebabs is what I was thinking of your recipes on Instagram on food, and I just wanted to share that anecdote of Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan was someone, there's a funny story of him being asked to sing in Delhi once, and the hosts happened to be vegetarian, and they put him up and they very sweetly offered him this very laboriously created thali full of vegetarian food. And there were these 5 katoris, 5 bowls on the plate, and he would dip his hands into each, hoping, and it would go hollow because there was no meat in each of these bowls. And he was so upset. He said, people say that you can get the fragrance of kebabs from my singing. How will I perform if I don't get to eat the meat I need to eat? So apparently all the people were pressed into action, and he set up a kitchen in the garden with loads of desi ghee and made these kebabs, and then he was ready to sing. So I think food and music is a really interesting connection.
Hand in hand, absolutely.
And this story is available in Rag and Josh, Sheila Dhar's book. So please read this book. I think it's one of the best. Some people have said she writes the best Indian English. She's unfortunately no longer with us. She was a musician and she loved cooking. So Sheila Dhar's Rag and Josh is a must read.
Wonderful, wonderful. So with that, folks, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow evening, where we will be joined by Dr. Nadra Khan from the Lahore University of Management Studies. And she will be speaking to us specifically about the architecture of the city of Lahore and the diversity of the architecture, and also the annexation of Punjab. So with that, thank you. Thank you once again, Radha.
Thank you, Ragini.
Bye, folks. Bye.